This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm absolutely delighted. I often say I'm delighted to welcome, but in this case it goes beyond. One of the names that has been on my list for the inception of this podcast, that name is Thomson. He is a writer that you will all know very well, so I'm not going to say anything else but except to say welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I've been reading your books for so many years, and I think the last one I read was How to Watch a Film. And you have this autobiographical way of addressing the film watching experience. You talk about your childhood, you talk about entering the cinema. At what point of that film going experience did you start thinking, I'm going to write about film? I'm looking at this with an angle which is not only the spectator, but there's something, I'm going to communicate this.
Well, in my teens, I guess about 14 or so, when I was, I suppose, studying to try to get into Oxford or Cambridge, my mother, quietly and calmly, because she was like that, said, you know, you're spending so much time going to the movies, and I wonder if it's eating into the time that you should be reading Paradise Lost or whatever. And she said, what I'd like you to do is to start writing something about the films you see. And I had never thought of that possibility, but quite quickly, I started writing 100 or 200 words or so about a movie. I think at first she read what I'd written. It was all handwritten. And occasionally she would comment, and she might say, well, that sounds pretty good, that film. Maybe we should go and see it again together. And I guess in the course of 3 or 4 years, I accumulated, I don't have them. I regret that, although I think I'd be horribly embarrassed by them, but probably accumulated 100 or so, not quite film reviews, but comments about films, you know. And it was an extraordinary education for me in that I had simply gone to the movies and absorbed them in the way we do, and still do, I think. But I hadn't dreamed that it was a thing that you could sort of step back from and ask yourself what you felt about a movie. And it was a profound practice and part of my very good relationship with my mother. And by the time I didn't go to Oxford and went to the London School of Film Technique instead, I discovered there that whereas there were people there who knew how to work a camera in ways I couldn't dream of, I could talk about a film in ways they couldn't match. So, you know, I mean, at that stage, my chief ambition was to make films. But the idea of commenting on them in some way, it was there beneath the surface.
Were you already very decided on your opinions? I remember a certain point where I was just so overjoyed to go and see movies that it took me quite a long time before I realized that a bad movie could exist. You know, I was just, you know, it was just like, oh, of course, movies are per se great. And then I saw a particularly bad movie and it was almost a revelation where I thought, hang on a minute, this is bad.
Yeah. I don't think I recall separating movies as a kid into good and bad. They all had an intensity for me that's what it was about. What it was about for me was to believe I was in the screen with the film. I was participating. And, you know, one can call that identification, fantasy, madness. All of those things are there available, but I went to be somewhere else, to be in the screen. And when I look back, and I can remember certain films I saw early on, which maybe were not as intense as like Red River or Meet Me in St. Louis, a couple of films that just moved me so much when I first saw them. And in looking back, I can see that some of the others were lesser films, but I didn't care. And I still find myself at this age. I'm not certain there are good or bad movies, if you know what I mean. I'm very suspicious of the whole system of ranking them and, saying that's the best film ever made, or that's the 53rd best film ever made. I think that's kind of silly. I think when we go to the movies and look at screens, we get involved playing with our own personality in remarkable, and I'm not sure they're wholesome or safe ways. I think there's something dangerous about this whole process of identification. But I think for me, that's what it's about. And I mean, I'm still thinking and writing about films as much as I ever have done. But it is in that, it's in terms of that sort of fantasy involvement. I like some films more than others, but I like to see almost any film. I'm more and more suspicious about, saying some are 5 stars, some are 3.5, that kind of thing. I think that's very artificial and silly. People today watch screens all the time. I mean, you and I are talking and we're doing it for sound, but we can see each other. Right. And seeing each other when the other person is not really here is an amazing transformation of reality. And at my advanced age, I feel I'm still grappling with that and trying to come to terms with it.
There's a strange thing that when I started watching films in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of those actors were still alive. And increasingly, we're looking at those old films and not only are the actors gone, but everybody in the film is gone. So we're really looking at shadows from a bygone era, but not in a sort of hooray for Hollywood sort of way, in a kind of the ghost in the machine, somewhat deeper and, as you said, more dangerous and frightening sometimes.
Yeah. And for me, coming to America was a huge step in so many ways, but not least in that I started meeting some of the people I had been seeing on screen for a long time. And I as a kid, I had been an absolute sucker for A Place in the Sun. And I had lunch with Elizabeth Taylor one day. And the amazement in discovering that she was cheeky and smart, funny, hurt sometimes, just like a real person. It was a sort of dazzling occasion. And I've only met and talked to a certain number of movie people, but I get enormous pleasure. I always find actors very interesting people to talk to. I don't think they believe they are interesting, but people who have done a massive pretending all through their life, I find fascinating, because I think one of the things the movies have done is to teach us all to be a little bit of an actor. Again, I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing. We do seem, in so many ways, to be getting deeper and deeper into madness, and I don't excuse the movies for some responsibility. I see a funny side to it, I think.
I always used to. Again, apologies for sort of harking back to our childhoods, but that's where we have that first, as you say, very intense relationship with films. But I did a whole raft of ridiculous hobbies because of the movies. I got interested in archaeology because of Indiana Jones. I even went boxing because a terrible sort of working man's club because of Rocky. I did karate because of Karate Kid. Loads of very bad life choices purely because of the movie.
Well, I mean, I remember when my wife and I moved from the East Coast of America to the West Coast, we started just driving to explore and going to Monument Valley. It was just staggering. It's a long way from anywhere, so it's quite a hard drive. And the weather there can be very extreme. But feeling that I was driving into a screen that I sort of knew quite well from the Ford films, but from other films too. And in America, I think, which obviously has been the location for so many films that I grew up on. The feeling of these places being tied up with their screen history is just amazing. The burning of Los Angeles, which I have not seen at the moment, I obviously I've been there a great deal. The idea of those locations being changed, transformed, is so emotional for me. And I think for people in the film business in LA, what's happened recently, it's just a staggering emotional shock. And I think it's going to come out in films, but in other forms of life too. The the way in which places are solidly actual and real, you can go there. But the way in which they are moving photographs in your mind is quite extraordinary, I think.
It's so interesting how everything is imaginary because that's how we perceive reality. But then there is this layer of reality there that you can go and stand, as you say, Valley. I stood in front of the Texas Chainsaw House and felt the shivers of being there, even though it's been converted into a rather bijou restaurant and boarding house. So it's still there, though. It's still recognizable.
Yeah.
I mean, you have these ideas of very solid connections, I feel, because your books are so populated by people. I mean, the most famous example of that would be the Biographical Dictionary of Film, which is, just a masterpiece of writing and scholarship and breadth. And I was reading after David Lynch's passing recently. I read your entry, as I often do, when anything happens in the film world or I'm about to watch a film. I read the entry on David Lynch. I just loved the way you sort of you steer between this appreciation of his work, and especially when it comes to something like Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive, but also a sort of a broader recognition of the man. It was a really interesting item to read.
I mean, that book changed. I was writing it, and that book was written in England.
Right.
I didn't come to America at all until 73, and I wrote the book from 71 through to 75. And initially, it was going to be a sort of encyclopedia of film, and there would be entries on the studios, the different countries, technical terms, things like that, as well as entries on people. And as I began writing it, I discovered that I found writing about what a tracking shot is rather tedious. I think I would find it much more interesting now. But the pieces on the people, they really turned me on, excited me. And I have a enormous interest in the creative mind. And as I said earlier, coming to America and meeting a lot of the people who had been almost mythical figures for me. Not always the best conversationalists, certainly not the best explainers of what they were doing. I mean, David Lynch, I met the day I saw Blue Velvet, I think, and I was completely bowled over by the film, and I was sort of incoherent about it because I was so excited by it, but so was he. I never knew with Lynch whether the sort of rather folksy, humble, shuffling around, not really knowing what to say about it. I was never sure whether that was an act or it was all authentic, because he was clearly a very intelligent man, and I'm sure he saw me as a critic. He could see that I loved the film, and that would have pleased him, obviously, but he didn't want to get into a conversation of what it was about. And I think that's very understandable, because I think there is a kind of creative personality that sees its own job as letting the oil well within you come out of the ground, thinking about a giant, and just expressing it without necessarily understanding it, and certainly without being able to explain it, because I think sometimes there are impulses that you just have to let run free. And a lot of the directors I've talked to are literally unable to explain what they were doing. Nicholas Ray, who was an enormously emotional but very intelligent director too. He could he 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 really couldn't talk about it, and it reminds me of the feeling that I had in the late 50s when I started reading Cahiers du Cinema, that you had a situation where these Hollywood veterans sat down with young, crazy French people, and the questions were longer than the answers because the questions would be, "This is what I think your film is about." And eventually the director would say, "Well, I'm not sure I thought about that, but gee, yeah, I guess so." And I think that's a very funny but very true reflection of what happens in a thing like film. To make a film is so insane. To be the person that 100 different people come to with questions. Should we move the camera there? Do you want the pink dress or the cherry colored dress? That kind of thing. All day long, you're dealing with those questions and you're trying to be true to some vision or dream you had about what this film might be, and handling so many different difficult people. I've done it a bit, and it's the most stressful situation I've ever been in. I would say, and that some people can handle it is just amazing. And it's too much to expect them to explain it at the same time. So, there is a way in which film commentary is about that. I mean, your book on Terence Malick, which I've just read, is a tremendous attempt to say what some very complicated but deeply buried films, if you know what I mean. There are things way below the surface in Malick. And I think that's what people like you and me should try to do. And I think that I think maybe the art of film commentary is not as rich as it used to be. People are not as interested in film as they were in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. But I think that's the job. And whether you're teaching or whether you're just writing about stuff, or even whether you're making a film, it's a challenge to get the intensity into a form that other people can see.
I wanted to ask you as well about, in terms of sort of explaining films, there are also those directors, and it sort of goes with their modus operandi of how they might deal with matters on the set. And I was thinking of Orson Welles, who, of course, is subject of one of your books, Rosebud. Yes, he's always strikes me as one of those great raconteurs, and he gives great interviews. And I'm never quite sure if the interviews and the films necessarily align exactly. Did you have the opportunity to meet him?
No, no. It's one of the big holes of the big regrets. I would have been enormously intimidated to meet him. And of course, he's an exception to what I was just saying, in that he was very articulate. He could talk about his own films, and he could talk about almost anything very well. As you say, he was a great raconteur, but never gave a dull interview. And there was a time of his life where I think doing the interviews was as fulfilling as maybe making the movies had been once upon a time. Because he was aware that every interview, certainly the long ones that the BBC did, and the interview books that he did with Bogdanovich and Henry Jaglom, they are really deserving a place in his filmography. There is much a revelation of him, or nearly as much a revelation of him as the films themselves. But no, I never met him, and I regret that deeply. But
I remember talking to someone. Well, I've talked to several people who have been involved with him in one way or another, and it just feels like even talking to someone one removed from Wells feels like something of a privilege.
Yes. Yeah.
Another aspect of your writing, which I really I really loved, is the way you've already talked about how you sort of transgress the lines that sometimes other people draw between sort of critic and practitioner, even though lots of critics have done that. You know, Truffaut and Godard have gone from being critics to being filmmakers, and you've done that yourself to some extent. But the book where you do this in a way which I found so creative and interesting was Suspects, where you use fiction as a form of I was going to say it's a form of criticism, but it's not even that. It's just such a freeing, liberating idea of looking at these people from a different aspect. And I guess today we would talk about them living in a shared universe or something. But the universe that you're talking about is almost like it's the movie verse, really. How did that book come about, and when are we going to get the sequel?
Well, I'll come to that in a moment. Someone wrote to me and said, this was after the Biographical Dictionary had appeared, what about a biographical dictionary of characters? And I was immediately aroused by that. And I responded, well, I'd love to do it or try it, but I think I have to make a world in which these characters exist. Therefore, I think it has to be done in one genre. And film noir seems to me a very enclosed genre. And the publisher said, sure, go ahead. I began to make a list of characters who might be in the book. I sketched a few of these lives out. And then one day I suddenly had the possibility that a character from that film, outside the time span of the films, had met that character from another film. And that was one of those sort of eureka moments, for me anyway. And I saw the possibility of a structure in which, like ghosts, these characters had a life of their own, which I felt I could open up while being true to the films. I never took the characters beyond what we know about them from the films, but I sort of enlarged their lives. And for me, it was an enormously important book because it opened up the possibility of fact and fiction marrying, screwing each other. And Suspects led in a few years to a book called Silver Light, which does the same for the Western. And then a couple of years ago, I published Connecticut, in which the genre is screwball comedy. And so it's three books that really I would hope people would read all together. And I think I would own up to it being a grand act of theft or appropriation and a measure of insanity, because it is crazy. But I have found a lot of people have come to me and said, it really helped me understand the films because you get at the atmosphere of the genres. And, you know, I think that one of the enormous appeals for me as a kid, and the kid who is now 83, in American genres is that they are locations of the mind where one can live and spend one's life. And I always find particularly entertaining. There is a big coterie out here on the West Coast, particularly in the Bay Area, for film noir because of the way Eddie Muller has made such a tribute to it. And you know, these people who lead very plain, timid lives, they sort of begin to act like characters from film noir. It's enormously entertaining. And, you know, you're in the film world. You know as well as I do how many people, in a quite respectable way, are walking fantasists. They are living out some legend from the screen. And certainly I have that feeling, and I'm unashamed of it. I think maybe there is something shaming in it, but I refuse to be cast down by it. That's the way I am. And I think that's the way a lot of people are. And I discover, or I find, observe, that if you ask people to talk about the films that mean a lot to them, they can do a top 10. as if they're in a Sight and Sound poll. And it's a very worthy list. But beneath it, there is another 10, which are the films they saw between the ages of, let's say, 6 and 16. Those are the films that really live with them.
The Where Eagles Dare and
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Carry On
Yeah, yeah.
Cleo.
There you are. There you are. You'll never give up on those films. You have learned the language that can say, well, really, it's an inferior work, you know. But in your imagination and in your memory, it's never going to go away. And I would love to dare to do a top 10 are simply silly films that mean so much to you.
Films that you don't want to defend on any,
Yes.
other than the pure joy of them,
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I mean, From Here to Eternity, I can see now it's not a great film, but I saw it, I guess, when I was 11 or 12, and it's always going to be one of the great emblems of what film is. And I refuse to give up on it.
I think that's so true, and I could reel off a list as I've already started.
Yeah.
Outland,
Right.
the Big Bus, that I'm not gonna in any way defend as great cinema. But if you say, I've got this DVD, can I pop it on? I would do it. Yeah, that's what I want to watch.
Yes, exactly.
I guess it's that thing of just pure enjoyment as well in cinema. I mean, one thing I was going to ask about this is it's great when you see a brand new film that does that same thing to you, or a film that is brand new to you. So, for instance, I watched Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. very recently. It was a discovery for me, and it was just like, oh my god, this is amazing. This does exactly what those films did for me when I was a kid.
Yeah,
it does for me now. And I try to think of a recent example. Oh well, last year there was a great comedy. I mean, I'm going to stick to comedies because they're so rarely celebrated.
Yeah,
there was a great Rachel Sennett comedy called Bottoms, which just basically took the high school kind of super bad formula and put it in the hands of two lesbians. And it was just so funny and so irreverent and violent and all the rest of it, over the top. And have you had any films recently that give you that kind of joy?
Indeed. The Brutalist, which I think is just about to open in England. It's an extraordinary film. And it has a very formal, stately intermission, a 15-minute intermission. At the point of the intermission, I felt I was seeing a great film. I think the first part of it is quite outstanding. I felt, I've only seen it the once, that in the second half, it rather fell apart. Although it's always interesting, but everyone is saying justifiably that Adrian Brody is very good in the film and a likely winner of the Oscar. True. Guy Pearce is flat out fucking fantastic in the film. And for those people who are going to see it, I would say just watch Guy Pearce. He's amazing. And I'm not sure that the film totally serves his character because he rather disappears before the end. That's part of the problems in the end. But anyway, The Brutalist just grabbed me and made me feel they still make great films. I thought Anora was in that category too. I love that film. I don't think it's been a great year overall. But yeah, no, I think I can still detect the kind of film that really turns me on. And the first part of The Brutalist, I would say, exactly like that. Yeah.
I think Sean Baker's Anora won the Palme d'Or this year in Cannes.
Yeah.
It struck me as like a screwball comedy,
absolutely,
but set in the sex industry. But it's got everything. It's got interfering family, a marriage, a couple that you think should be together, but then you realize the real couple is in the background. And
yeah. and a lot of sex. And it's for me, it's been a sadness that because of all the revelations about how appallingly people in the film business have behaved, filmmaking itself has become nervous about sex, I think, and that's a dangerous way to go because I think the the fantasizing over sex has always been a huge part of film entertainment. And Nora struck me as a film that just refused to be ashamed.
Yeah, a bit like, I mean, Sean Baker does that quite a lot in all of his films. I think all of his films are more or less
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No.
either about sex
Yeah.
workers or people in
Yes.
pornography or
Yeah.
something. And
Yeah.
he always
Absolutely.
uses, he doesn't seem to use artificial tricks or anything. He seems to
Yeah.
full on and in your face, which I appreciate. He's a very exciting filmmaker, I think, and
Yeah.
I hope to
Very.
see more
Yeah.
from him. Going on to the way you developed during your writing. More recently, you've been very engaged, and the last book I read by you, it talks a lot about Breaking Bad and Sopranos and things, and you very much blur that line between cinema and long form television as a way of
Yeah.
going and getting a corollary, if that's a word, narrative. Tell us a little bit about your interest in television. That golden age of television, which to some extent is still upon us.
Well, I was regarded as a kid who spent too much time watching movies. And I probably watched, on average, two and a half, three films a week. I went to the films that were playing at the local cinema in South London. And so let's say I saw three films a week. At the most, that was 6 hours. Within a few years, I was sometimes watching 6 hours TV a day. And that has only increased with the mechanisms that you and I are using now on Zoom, and above all, with the most extraordinary film screen there's ever been so far, the iPhone. And I just found it artificial and rather sort of archaic to insist that cinema was cinema where you had to go into a big dark place because the dark place was at home and we were watching all the time. And television, even in its sort of earliest antiquated days when it was afraid of itself, was very cautious about what it was showing. But there was a montage on television, a natural, recurring montage of fiction, of news, of advertisements, and a range of things that I think explodes what cinema had been doing. So I reached a point where I felt it was crazy to put television down and to ignore it, and for film magazines not to treat it. And I remember a little, not a battle quite, but a pressure I was trying to exert on Sight and Sound in the days when Nick James was the editor, that say, we got to talk about some of these things because The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad, just to name obvious candidates, they're extraordinary films, and they are films. And I interviewed Vince Gilligan once, and he was probably more interesting than 90% of the film directors you ever talk to because he knew he was making an immense chronicle that worked in the way movies worked, that was beautiful in the way movies are, that used acting in the same sort of way. And so I've just become more and more interested in that. And I mean, that is now the past, that moment of recognizing what long form television could do. What's happening now with small screens is quite uncanny, and I don't think it's a safe way to go, but it's a way we're going without any question. I love to go into a big theater and see a film like The Brutalist, but I can't tell myself or try to tell anyone that that is more important in quotes than the mass of stuff we're all exposed to all the time on screens. Screens are their life, and it's wonderful to be able to see you and to feel the beginning of a relationship and knowing you. But I know at the same time that I probably will never actually sit down with you in the same place and touch you and, have a physical existence. You're going to be a screened person for me. And that's an amazing extension of the way we try to live.
I always think of, I think it was Niels Bohr and Einstein when they had that famous argument about, God can't create the universe like this. Stop telling God how he can, what to do with the universe.
Yeah.
And I sort of feel like that about culture. You can't tell the culture, I disapprove of you. Stop doing this, because the culture is going to do what it wants to do,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm playing with the idea at the moment of a book that treats Donald Trump as an actor only. And it's an incredible possibility that way beyond electing Ronald Reagan as a president, we have elected a man who simply cannot exist without acting his own role. And the Dr. Mabuse-like possibilities in where he's going and where we're going to have to go to. We're in a horror movie.
And it's kind of a problem with the culture trying to respond to him as well, is there's no exaggeration which is going to be enough.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm really interested about that. Are you going to sort of include sort of like his Home Alone 2 cameo? And that would be... do it. I definitely... Yeah. Another thing about television, just before we leave television, I'm also fascinated by the fact that it's become the home to the most cinematic of genres, the Western. You had Deadwood right at the beginning, but you've also had, since then you've had Godless. I know that Kevin Costner's most recent attempt, Horizon, which I loved, I got frostily stared at Cannes when I cheered at the end of that part one of his sort of 3 or 4 part epic. But even that seems to be ultimately designed for television, even though it's amazing on the big screen. But something as cinematic as television, as the Western is finding its true home on television. So it's kind of like, if cinema isn't doing the Western, then it really doesn't have any argument against television. If you see what I mean?
I absolutely see what you mean, and it is very interesting the way in which the Western simply won't go away. It seems to be dormant for a period, but then it comes back again. And I think Costner is a very interesting figure. It's intriguing too, because people always talk about the small screen as being a diminution of cinema, and I have often talked about the power of a face bigger than a building that you can get in a big theater with a classic movie. But I have to say this, a few years ago, I was watching soccer, which is actually as big a passion in my life as anything.
What's your team?
Chelsea is my team.
Okay.
But I was watching Liverpool.
That's my team.
And we cut to a close-up of Mo Salah, and I could see the extent of his unshaved face. I could see the sweat. And I suddenly realized that I hadn't seen that kind of thing on a big screen. The small screen, and I think this is overlooked horribly, the small screen has a visual intensity that the screens in big cinemas now do not have. And going along with the idea that you can't beat the big screen, I think is a foolishness. I think the small screen is more radiant. Use that word. Real emotional value word. It's more emotional than the big screen. The standards of projection in our big screens are terrible nowadays. A lot of places have wretched sound, when in theory, the medium should be at its technological best. But I think the power of image in the big on the big screen has actually shrunk, and the small screen is I think it's more alive than the big screen.
That's really interesting. I read a book Ken Russell wrote, and he's obviously a provocateur, but he
Yeah,
ends one of his chapters saying, "I can't wait until the last cinema closes because all the projectionists can join the dole for all
right.
they care."
Yeah,
Because he just resented them so much
yeah.
for ruining his films.
I mean, one of the things about big theaters is they need big audiences.
Right.
And it was wonderful a year or so ago, whenever it was, to go and see Barbie, which is not a great film, but it's a great entertainment. And the source of the entertainment was that it was hard to get in.
Hmm.
It was packed with young people who were having a wonderful time. And it made me realize how seldom lately I had in packed cinemas. In the 1950s, I remember being turned away from the cinema because I couldn't get in. And that's a wonderful thing, a wonderful quality, because it makes you crazy to go back earlier next time and get in.
And you could hear the sound leaking from the film, and like, oh,
Oh,
it's so
absolutely. And the way 2,000 people are scared all at the same time, that's a dazzling thing and very exciting. And if the big cinemas are four-fifths empty, which is usually the case these days, then close them. They were of their time, and it was a wonderful time. But if you want a crowd, go to a soccer match or go to a sporting event, because there is that kind of mad, frenzied excitement that used to exist in every theater.
there is that sense of preciousness about cinemas, and maybe if there's, I mean, I love the cinema. I love going to the cinema. I love going to great festival showings, but
Yeah,
outside of festival
yeah,
showings, the last few times I've been in a cinema that was genuinely full was probably
yeah.
Barbie, Joker, and Oppenheimer. Those are the last three films I've seen, and those are like
There
what?
you are.
Sorry, in a span of 5 years.
Yeah,
And I thought it was crazy that at the end of Barbie, I was in Italy watching it. At the end of Barbie, everyone cheered. It was a wonderful feeling that they felt like they wanted to
yeah.
cheer at the screen,
Oh, yeah.
The community is all with that, and it will be very sad if it's lost. But as apropos your point, I remember an Orson Welles interview where he talked about how cinema was dead because it was opera singers at the beginning of the century, and then it was cinema, and now it's pop singers, and then it'll be on to the next thing. And I thought that was very interesting,
Yeah.
that idea. Nothing lasts forever. We don't have to protect this as an art form.
Well, that's the
It will look after
that's
itself.
that's the truth. Yeah, yeah.
Rounding off our conversation, and thank you so much for your time, David. I'd also like to ask you for your own inspiration as a writer in terms of other film writers that you've read, and maybe if you want to recommend some for our listeners, because we often have a recommended film book at the end of the show so that they can explore further the writing of others.
There are a number of writers that I just read and read. They're not known as film critics per se, but they are people that have just helped me feel more for writing. And in no particular order of importance, Jeff Dyer, we're friends. And
Where Eagles Dare, there's a connection as well.
yes, and he's just a fantastic writer, and I value his work enormously. A close friend here in the Bay Area is Greil Marcus,
Oh,
who
superb writer.
very smart on film, but obviously music is his main subject. Coming to America, I found reading Joan Didion just flat out helpful. The rhythms of the language and the way of understanding here in her. Norman Mailer, a filmmaker sometimes, very shrewd on film itself, very, very smart about the way personality had become a sort of public commodity. Gore Vidal. Among film critics, it's very difficult to distinguish respect and interest from sheer affection. Molly Haskell is a very important personal friend. Andy was too, Andy Saris. Richard Corliss, one of the people I most miss. Critics I sort of mingled with when I came to this country and learned so much from, but just enjoyed being with. Pauline Kael, I didn't enjoy her personally. We didn't get on, but a fantastic writer still. But, those are the people who come to mind quickly.
You mentioned her in a book where you, in the last book I read, where you talk about her, how she watches a film and she's sort of scribbling notes, but her notes are full sentences. And so she's going up to the screen and back down and up to the screen and back down.
It was quite amazing.
Yeah.
We were watching Brad De Palma's The Fury, a forgotten film. And the first time I met her, and I realized that this quite small woman sitting next to me was writing away throughout the film. And I found that more interesting than The Fury. And I don't say that she was writing a review as she watched the film, but she was getting pretty close to it. And she was an extraordinary writer and a huge influence. She changed the way people think and write about film. And she became a known personality in the way that there are really no critics at that level today.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the last sort of critic as personality would be someone like Roger Ebert. That's largely as well.
Roger Ebert was, and he was a great guy and a lot of fun to be with. I think he had mixed feelings about thumbs up and thumbs down, because he was capable of a much more refined appreciation of films. But,
Well, that's an interesting point as well. Is I'm always interested in how I change my mind about films, how I watch a film and I think, work of genius, and I watch it again and I think, well, it's not that, And I'd recently watched, talking about The Brutalist, I watched Vox Lux, the second film by Brady Corbett.
Yeah.
And I'd originally given it a sort of rave review. And then I watched it again and I thought, there's something that just doesn't work about this film. And for me, it was Natalie Portman being so disconnected from herself as a child that the characters seem like two entirely different people.
Yeah.
And it broke it for me. It sort of broke the film. I had lots to admire, but I couldn't watch it as a singular experience,
Yeah. But you're touching on something really profound, which is how, as we grow older, the films change. Obviously, they aren't changing; they're the same film, but we've changed. And one of the reasons I feel more dubious about film criticism per se is exactly what you're talking about: the way the mind changes, the way something that you loved once now looks less than you thought it was, and the reverse, that films you had written off suddenly come to life. And it's one of the great reasons for going back to movies you think you understood a year ago, or 50 years ago, and finding that there's something else. Yeah.
I remember walking out of the cinema and thinking, that was okay. That was fine. Nothing special there. And then rewatching it and thinking, that's one of the best American films I've ever seen. I don't know why I missed it.
Yeah.
Well, David, absolute delight to talk to you. I'm so.
Well, for me too.
Been real fun, and hopefully we can talk again at even before your Donald Trump book hits the bookstore.
Okay. Anyway, I just want to end by recommending to the listeners John Bleasdale's book on Terrence Malick, which I think is a book that the subject deserves. I can't say better than that.
Oh, that's so kind of you, David. That is so kind of you.
Good work. Well done.